Laura Bennett locked the door to her efficiency apartment on the fourth floor of the Harborview complex in Baltimore at exactly 6:47 on the morning of September 14th, 1985. Her neighbor, Mrs. Greta Paulson, remembered the sound of Laura's white sneakers squeaking against the linoleum hallway because Greta had been awake with insomnia, listening to the building settle in the pre-dawn quiet. Laura worked the night shift at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and that morning she was heading home after 12 exhausting hours in the pediatric ward. The silver locket she always wore, a simple oval piece engraved with tiny roses, caught the dim hallway light as she turned toward the elevator. Greta waved. Laura smiled back, tired but warm, and pressed the elevator button. That was the last confirmed sighting of Laura Bennett for 24 years. The elevator surveillance camera had been broken for 3 weeks, a fact that would haunt the Baltimore Police Department for decades. Laura's 1979 Honda Accord was found in the hospital parking garage 2 days later, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet, $43 in cash, and her nursing license inside. The locket was gone. Everything else remained. If you're following this story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all around the world. Now let's continue. Laura's mother, Dorothy Bennett, was a retired schoolteacher who lived in a narrow brick row house in the Fells Point neighborhood, just 15 minutes from Laura's apartment. When Laura didn't call on Sunday evening, their standing weekly phone call, Dorothy felt an immediate, visceral dread. Laura was punctual to a fault. She'd been that way since childhood, the kind of girl who set her alarm 10 minutes early and never missed a commitment. Dorothy drove to Laura's apartment that night and convinced the building superintendent to unlock the door. The apartment was pristine. Laura's bed was made with military precision, her scrubs folded in the laundry basket, a half-eaten container of Chinese takeout in the refrigerator. Nothing was missing except Laura herself. Detective Raymond Detective Vincent Marsh, was assigned to the case. He was a veteran investigator with the Baltimore police, a man in his early 50s with graying temples and a reputation for dogged persistence. Marsh interviewed everyone in Laura's life. Her co-workers at Johns Hopkins, her nursing school friends, the pharmacist at the corner drugstore where she picked up her allergy medication, even the dry cleaner who pressed her uniforms. Everyone described Laura the same way: kind, reliable, private. She didn't date much. She didn't drink or use drugs. She attended Mass at St. Casimir's every Sunday morning when her schedule allowed. She sent half her paycheck to her mother and saved the rest. She was, by all accounts, a woman who lived a quiet, decent life. But Marsh discovered something others had missed. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Laura had visited a lawyer's office in Towson, a suburb north of Baltimore. The attorney, Gerald Hoffman, was reluctant to discuss client matters, but after persistent questioning and a court order, he revealed that Laura had come to inquire about adoption records. Laura herself had been adopted as an infant in 1957, and she wanted to find her birth mother. Hoffman had explained the legal complexities, Maryland's sealed adoption records, the difficulty of locating biological parents, the emotional risks involved. Laura had listened carefully, thanked him, and left. She never returned for a follow-up appointment. Dorothy Bennett was devastated by this revelation. She'd always been open with Laura about the adoption, had answered every question with honesty and love. She'd assumed Laura was content with their relationship, that the bond between them was enough. Learning that Laura had been searching for her biological mother felt, to Dorothy, like a rejection, though she knew, rationally, it wasn't. Marsh gently suggested that Laura's search might have led her into dangerous territory, that she might have made contact with someone from her past, someone who didn't want to be found. Dorothy clung to that theory like a lifeline. At least it meant Laura might still be alive. The investigation stretched into months, then years. Marsh retired in 1994, and the case file was transferred to a younger detective who had less emotional investment and more active cases demanding attention. Laura's disappearance became a cold case, one of hundreds gathering dust in the Baltimore police archives. Dorothy Bennett continued to search on her own, placing ads in newspapers, hiring private investigators she couldn't afford, attending support groups for families of missing persons. She kept Laura's apartment exactly as it had been for 5 years, paying the rent out of her teacher's pension, until finally the building management insisted she clear it out. Dorothy boxed everything and stored it in her basement, a shrine to a daughter who had vanished like smoke. In the summer of 2001, Dorothy suffered a stroke. She survived, but her left side was partially paralyzed, and she required around-the-clock care. A visiting nurse named Claudia Reeves came to the Fells Point Row House 3 times a week to help with bathing, medication, and physical therapy. Claudia was in her late 30s, efficient and compassionate, and over time she and Dorothy developed a bond that went beyond the professional. Dorothy talked about Laura constantly, her childhood, her dedication to nursing, the mystery of her disappearance. Claudia listened with genuine interest, asking questions, offering comfort. One afternoon in October 2003, Dorothy showed Claudia a photograph of Laura wearing the silver locket, taken at her nursing school graduation. Claudia studied the photo for a long time, her expression unreadable. 2 weeks later, Claudia returned to Dorothy's house with unexpected news. She'd been shopping at a pawn shop in East Baltimore, looking for a used stethoscope for a nursing student she was mentoring, when she'd spotted a silver locket in the jewelry case. The locket had roses engraved on the front. Claudia had asked to see it, and when the shop owner handed it to her, she'd opened it. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, faded and yellowed, one of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, the other of an older woman who looked exactly like Dorothy Bennett. Claudia had bought the locket on the spot for $25. Dorothy's hands trembled as she held the locket. There was no question. It was Laura's. She'd given it to her daughter on her 21st birthday, had placed her own photo inside, along with Laura's nursing school portrait. The silver had tarnished slightly, but the engraving was unmistakable. Dorothy insisted they go to the police immediately. Claudia drove her to the precinct, and they met with Detective Angela Winters, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who'd recently taken over the cold case unit. Winters examined the locket, listened to the story, and promised to investigate. The pawn shop was called Eddie's Exchange, a cramped storefront wedged between a laundromat and a bodega on Eastern Avenue. The owner, Edward Landry, was a heavy-set man in his 60s with nicotine-stained fingers and a suspicious demeanor. He kept meticulous records, as required by law, and after some grumbling, he produced a logbook showing that the locket had been pawned on August 3, 2003, just 2 months earlier, by a woman named Rita Callahan. She'd provided a driver's license as identification, and Landry had photocopied it, as was his practice. The address listed was in Dundalk, a working-class neighborhood southeast of Baltimore. Winters ran Rita Callahan's name through the system. She was 68 years old, a retired seamstress with no criminal record beyond a few unpaid parking tickets. Winters and her partner, Detective Luis Ortega, drove to the Dundalk address on a grey November morning. The house was a small bungalow with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. Rita Callahan answered the door, wearing a faded housecoat and slippers. She was a thin woman, with white hair pulled back in a bun, her face lined with the deep creases of someone who'd lived a hard life. When Winters explained why they were there, Rita's expression didn't change. She invited them inside without protest. The interior of the house was cluttered but clean, filled with the smell of coffee and old upholstery. Rita sat in a worn armchair and folded her hands in her lap. Winters asked her about the locket, and Rita answered in a quiet, steady voice. She said she'd found it in a shoebox in her attic 2 months earlier, while cleaning out old belongings. She didn't know where it had come from, assumed it had belonged to her late mother, or perhaps an aunt. She'd needed money for her electric bill, so she'd pawned it. She had no idea it had belonged to a missing woman. Winters didn't believe her. She pressed Rita for details. When exactly had she found the locket? Had anyone else lived in the house? Had she ever met a woman named Laura Bennett? Rita's answers were consistent but vague. She lived alone. She'd owned the house since 1978. She'd never heard of Laura Bennett. Winters obtained a warrant to search the property, and a team of forensic technicians spent 2 days combing through the house and yard. They found nothing, no signs of violence, no hidden remains, no evidence connecting Rita to Laura's disappearance. The attic yielded boxes of old clothes, family photographs, and forgotten keepsakes, but nothing incriminating. Frustrated, Winters decided to dig deeper into Rita Callahan's past. She discovered that Rita had been married briefly in the 1950s to a man named Patrick Callahan, a dock worker at the port of Baltimore. The marriage had ended in divorce after 3 years. More significantly, Winters learned that Rita had given birth to a daughter in December 1957, a daughter she'd placed for adoption through Catholic Charities. The adoption had been closed, the records sealed, as was standard practice at the time. The pieces began to fall into place. Winters contacted Catholic Charities and, after navigating layers of bureaucracy and legal red tape, obtained confirmation that the child Rita Callahan had given up in 1957 had been adopted by Dorothy Bennett. The child's name was Laura. Winters returned to Rita's house with this information. This time, Rita's composure cracked. She sat at her kitchen table, tears streaming down her weathered face, and told a story she'd kept buried for nearly half a century. She'd been 19 when she got pregnant, unmarried, and terrified. Her family was devoutly Catholic, and the shame of an illegitimate child was unbearable. She'd been sent to a home for unwed mothers in Pennsylvania, where she'd given birth alone and frightened. The nuns had taken the baby immediately, and Rita had been told to forget, to move on, to never speak of it again. She'd tried. She'd married Patrick Callahan a year later, hoping to build a new life, but the marriage had been loveless and brief. She'd worked as a seamstress for 40 years, lived alone, and carried the weight of her secret in silence. In the spring of 1985, Rita had done something she'd sworn she'd never do. She'd contacted Catholic Charities, asking if there was any way to find her daughter. The agency had told her the records were sealed. That reunion was only possible if the adoptee initiated contact. Frustrated and desperate, Rita had hired a private investigator, a man named Jack Delaney, who operated out of a shabby office in South Baltimore. Delaney was unscrupulous but effective. He'd tracked down Laura's name and address within a month. Rita had paid him $300, money she'd saved from years of careful budgeting. Rita admitted that she'd gone to Laura's apartment building in August 1985. She'd waited in the lobby for hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of the daughter she'd given away. She'd seen Laura come and go twice, but she'd never had the courage to approach her. Laura had looked so composed, so put together, and Rita had felt like a ghost from a shameful past. She'd left without speaking to her. But Rita insisted she hadn't seen Laura on the morning of September 14th, 1985. She hadn't been anywhere near the apartment building. She had no idea what had happened to Laura, and she swore on everything she held sacred that she hadn't harmed her daughter. The locket, she claimed, had been mailed to her anonymously in a padded envelope in late September 1985, a few weeks after Laura's disappearance. There had been no return address, no note, no explanation. Rita had recognized it from one of the few times she'd seen Laura. Laura had been wearing it both times Rita had observed her. Rita had kept the locket hidden in her attic for 18 years, too frightened to go to the police, too guilt-ridden to throw it away. Winters was skeptical, But Rita's story held a terrible logic. If someone had wanted to taunt Rita, to punish her for abandoning her child, sending the locket would have been a cruel and effective gesture. Winters asked if Rita still had the envelope. Rita shook her head. She'd thrown it away decades ago. Winters requested a polygraph test. Rita agreed. The results were inconclusive, neither clearly indicating deception nor confirming truthfulness. Winters shifted her focus to Jack Delaney, the private investigator Rita had hired. Delaney had died in 1998 from cirrhosis of the liver, but Winters tracked down his former assistant, a woman named Beverly Grant, who now worked as a paralegal in Annapolis. Beverly remembered the Callahan case vividly. Delaney had been obsessed with it, she said, because once he'd found Laura, he'd continued to follow her. Beverly had thought it was strange at the time. Rita Callahan had only paid for basic locate services, but Delaney had spent weeks surveilling Laura, taking notes, documenting her routines. Beverly had asked him why, and Delaney had said he was considering approaching Laura himself, offering to broker a reunion between mother and daughter for an additional fee. Beverly had warned him it was a bad idea, possibly illegal, but Delaney had been broke and desperate. Beverly didn't know if Delaney had ever contacted Laura directly, but she remembered that he'd been agitated in the days following Laura's disappearance. He'd come into the office muttering about bad luck and bad timing, and he'd destroyed all his files related to the Callahan case, something he'd never done before. Beverly had assumed he was worried about being implicated in Laura's disappearance, though she had no evidence he'd been involved. Winters obtained a warrant to exhume what remained of Delaney's records, stored in a warehouse by his widow. The files were mostly ruined by water damage and mold, but Winters found fragments, scraps of surveillance notes, partial photographs, a torn page listing Laura's work schedule. One note, barely legible, referenced a meeting with a man named T. Galloway on September 12, 1985. The note included a dollar amount, $5,000. Winters ran the name through every database available. She found a Thomas Galloway who'd lived in Baltimore in the 1980s, a mechanic who'd worked at a garage near the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Galloway had left Maryland in 1987 and moved to Florida, where he'd remarried and started a new life. Winters contacted the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, and they located Galloway in Clearwater, now 71 years old and retired. Winters flew to Florida to interview him. Thomas Galloway was a soft-spoken man with trembling hands and the haunted look of someone who'd carried a burden for too long. When Winters mentioned Laura Bennett's name, Galloway closed his eyes and nodded slowly. He'd been waiting for this conversation for 24 years. Galloway explained that in 1985 he'd been married to a woman named Diane, a nurse who'd worked at Johns Hopkins with Laura. Diane had struggled with depression and alcoholism, and their marriage had been volatile. In August 1985, Diane had become convinced that Laura was having an affair with Galloway, an accusation that was entirely false. Laura and Galloway had barely known each other. They'd spoken perhaps 3 times in passing when he'd picked Diane up from work. But Diane's paranoia had spiraled out of control, fueled by alcohol and untreated mental illness. On September 12, 1985, Jack Delaney had approached Galloway at the garage where he worked. Delaney had told him that he knew about Diane's obsession with Laura, and he'd offered Galloway a deal. For $5,000, Delaney would handle the situation. He'd scare Laura enough to make her quit her job and leave Baltimore, removing the source of Diane's fixation. Galloway, desperate and terrified that Diane might hurt Laura or herself, had agreed. He'd emptied his savings and given Delaney the money. Galloway swore he'd never intended for Laura to be harmed. He'd thought Delaney would maybe follow her, leave a threatening note, make a phone call, something that would frighten her but not endanger her. When Laura disappeared 2 days later, Galloway had been horrified. He'd confronted Delaney, who'd claimed he had nothing to do with it, that the timing was just coincidence. Galloway hadn't believed him, but he'd been too afraid to go to the police. He was complicit. He'd paid money to have a woman intimidated, and he feared he'd be arrested. So he'd kept silent, and the guilt had eaten at him for decades. Diane Galloway had died in 1993 from complications of liver disease. Thomas had remarried, but he'd never told his second wife about Laura. He'd tried to bury the past, but it had never truly left him. Winters asked if Delaney had ever mentioned where he might have taken Laura or what he might have done. Galloway said Delaney had owned a small cabin in western Maryland, near Deep Creek Lake, a place he used for fishing trips. Galloway had only been there once, years earlier, but he remembered the general location. Winters returned to Maryland and assembled a team to search the area Galloway had described. It took 3 weeks of combing through property records and interviewing locals before they found the cabin, now abandoned and nearly collapsed. The structure was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a rutted dirt road. Forensic teams brought ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They found Laura's remains buried in a shallow grave, 50 yards behind the cabin. Her skeleton was mostly intact, still clothed in the scrubs she'd worn the morning she disappeared. Dental records confirmed her identity. The medical examiner determined that she'd died from blunt force trauma to the skull, likely a single blow. Her death had been quick, though that offered little comfort. The investigation concluded that Jack Delaney had intercepted Laura in the hospital parking garage on the morning of September 14, 1985. He'd likely approached her under some pretext, perhaps claiming to have information about her biological mother, something he'd learned from Rita Callahan. Laura, trusting and unsuspecting, had probably gone with him willingly. At some point, whether at the cabin or during the drive, something had gone wrong. Perhaps Laura had realized she was in danger and tried to escape. Perhaps Delaney had panicked. The exact circumstances would never be known, but the result was tragedy. Delaney had taken Laura's locket, possibly as a trophy, possibly with the intention of tormenting Rita Callahan by mailing it to her, a twisted message about the consequences of her choices. He'd disposed of Laura's body in the woods and returned to Baltimore, where he'd continued his life as if nothing had happened. He died without ever facing justice. Dorothy Bennett was 83 years old when Laura's remains were identified. She'd spent 24 years not knowing, hoping against hope, living in the limbo of uncertainty. The news of Laura's death was devastating, but it also brought a measure of peace. Dorothy finally knew what had happened. She could bury her daughter, mourn properly, and perhaps begin to heal. Rita Callahan attended Laura's funeral, standing at the back of St. Casimir's church, weeping silently. Dorothy saw her there and after the service approached her. The two women stood in the church parking lot, face to face for the first time, connected by love and loss and a shared tragedy. Dorothy didn't speak at first, just looked at Rita with eyes that had cried too many tears. Then she reached out and took Rita's hand. They stood that way for a long time, two mothers grieving the same daughter, bound by a sorrow that transcended anger or blame. Rita told Dorothy everything, the circumstances of Laura's birth, the shame and fear that had driven her decision, the regret that had haunted her ever since. Dorothy listened without interruption. When Rita finished, Dorothy said quietly that she understood, that she'd always known Laura's birth mother must have loved her to give her a chance at a better life. They sat together on a bench outside the church and looked at photographs, Dorothy's pictures of Laura growing up, Rita's single photograph of the infant she'd held for only a few minutes before the nuns took her away. In the months that followed, Dorothy and Rita developed a tentative friendship, meeting for coffee once a week, sharing memories and filling in the gaps of Laura's life. Dorothy showed Rita Laura's nursing school diploma, Her awards for compassionate care, letters from patients' families thanking her for her kindness. Rita showed Dorothy the locket, which the police had returned after the investigation concluded. Together, they decided to bury it with Laura, placing it around her neck in the casket where it belonged. Thomas Galloway was never charged with a crime. The statute of limitations had long expired, and prosecutors determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges related to conspiracy or accessory after the fact. Galloway sent a letter to Dorothy Bennett, apologizing and accepting responsibility for his role in the tragedy. Dorothy never responded. Some wounds she believed were too deep for forgiveness, though she no longer carried hatred in her heart. She was simply too tired. Laura was buried in a small cemetery in Catonsville, a quiet place with old trees and well-tended grass. Her headstone was simple: Laura Ann Bennett, 1957–1985, beloved daughter and devoted nurse. Beneath those words, Dorothy had added a line: she lived to help others. It was true. Laura had chosen a profession of service and compassion, had spent her short life caring for sick children, had been loved by everyone who knew her. Her death was a senseless waste, but her life had mattered. Detective Angela Winters closed the case file in January 2004. It had taken 24 years, but Laura Bennett had finally come home. Winters attended the funeral, standing in the back with other investigators who'd worked on the case over the decades, including Vincent Marsh, now retired and in his 70s. They didn't speak much, just stood together in silence, witnesses to the end of a long and painful journey. Dorothy Bennett lived for 5 more years, long enough to see a scholarship established in Laura's name at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, funded by donations from former colleagues and patients' families. The first recipient was a young woman from West Baltimore who wanted to work in pediatrics, just like Laura. Dorothy attended the award ceremony in a wheelchair, her hands still clutching a photograph of Laura in her nurse's uniform. She died peacefully in her sleep in 2009, at the age of 88. Rita Callahan outlived Dorothy by 3 years, passing away in 2012 at the age of 80. In her will, she left her small estate to the Laura Bennett Scholarship Fund. It wasn't much, just the proceeds from selling her Dundalk bungalow and a modest savings account, but it ensured that Laura's legacy would continue. Young nurses would study and graduate and care for patients, carrying forward the compassion that Laura had embodied. The silver locket with the engraved roses rests with Laura still, buried in the Catonsville Cemetery. On clear days, sunlight filters through the trees and touches the grave, warming the earth where a daughter, lost and found, finally rests in peace.